Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Providence. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the year 1830, Providence was still a city of contrasts, cobbled streets and new factories beside silent, marshy fields. The Woonasquatucket River cut through rows of weathered mills, its waters sluggish from the spring melt. Along Benefit Street, families of modest means tended gardens behind narrow houses, and gossip was often more common than prayer. It was there, in a tall grey home with green shutters, that the Caldwell sisters were last seen in good health. Their names were Eveline and Clara Caldwell, daughters of a tailor and a midwife who had passed several winters prior. By town accounts, the sisters rarely mingled beyond errands. They were described as quiet and exceedingly proper, though a neighbor later remarked, there was always something in their eyes, as though they were waiting for a sound no one else could hear. Records from the Rhode Island. Historical societies show that 1830 was marked by an unseasonable chill and several unexplained fevers spreading through the harbor wards. Only 2 years later, the city would be gripped by the cholera outbreak of 1832, an event that changed Providence's sense of safety forever. A reference documented in the 1832 cholera pandemic archives. That epidemic became the backdrop of many whispered accounts, including that of the Caldwells. The sisters' home, according to the County Register of Properties Volume 4, stood on land once owned by a merchant named Silas Meacham, who perished during a voyage in 1829. The deed passed to the Caldwells for a suspiciously low sum, $41, and a crate of sewing instruments. Locals noted that Meacham's belongings had been auctioned hastily, some still damp from the sea. By the early spring of 1830, the Caldwells had withdrawn almost entirely from their parish circle. The rector, Reverend Elias Dorr, made 2 visits in March but was refused entry on both occasions. In his later affidavit to Town Constable Jonas Petterson, he wrote, "The elder one, Eveline, spoke through the door, her voice steady but hollow. She said their mother's spirit was not yet at rest, and that the house could not be crossed by anyone with doubt in his heart." Neighbors began to notice that the house never opened its shutters during daylight. Milk left on the stoop went sour, yet no one retrieved it. A lamplighter named Tobias Crow testified that he saw figures moving behind the curtains at impossible hours, not like people walking, more like shadows remembering the shape of someone gone. By midsummer, when the first cholera warnings began arriving from New York ports, the Caldwell residence was silent. No visitors, no deliveries, only a faint odor that drifted through the lilac hedge. By August of that year, the neighbors on Benefit Street had grown uneasy. The Caldwell house stood shuttered in both heat and storm, the paint on its clapboards bubbling under the relentless summer sun. The scent, faintly sweet and iron-like, worsened by the week. When a physician named Dr. Lyman Birch volunteered to investigate, he found the front door locked and the key still in the latch, rusted in place. He left a note under the sill, dated August 22, 1830, urging any inhabitant to answer within 3 days, for their own health and for the comfort of their neighbors. No reply came. Constable Petterson, the same who had recorded Reverend Dorr's affidavit, later recalled how the case first entered public record. It began as a matter of sanitation, he wrote in his report to the town clerk. Not suspicion. Providence, being near the wharves, had learned to fear any hint of disease, especially after word from the southern ports. Those southern ports were precisely where the first maritime accounts of strange illnesses had originated, a precursor, as historians would later note in their summaries of the 1832 cholera pandemic, to the deadly wave that soon reached New England. It was in that climate of dread that the constable finally forced entry into the Caldwell home. Inside, the air was stale but not fetid. Dust thickened the corners of the parlor, and an unfinished sampler hung from the mantel, its embroidery spelling only "evil." A faint trace of lavender water clung to the curtains. On the dining table, plates were laid as if for 2, bread hardened into stone, cups rimmed with residue. Yet there were no bodies, no blood, no struggle. The hearth was cold, and the bedchambers above were perfectly made. Dr. Birch noted in his journal that the rooms seemed too orderly, too deliberate, as though their occupants had only stepped away for a moment, a very long moment. Behind the kitchen, however, they found something stranger. Beneath the loose boards near the back wall, a crawl space had been cleared, holding 3 small glass bottles filled with cloudy liquid. Birch took them to his surgery on Waterman Street for examination. One was marked with a fragment of label reading Essent, Bellad, a known tincture of belladonna used sparingly for pain. Rumors began to circulate before any official statement was made. Children passing by the property said they saw a light glowing in the cellar at dusk. A laundress swore she heard voices chanting through the floorboards as she hung sheets nearby. 2 women speaking the same sentence at once, she told the Evening Bulletin, but not in the same tone. By late September, townsfolk started calling it the house that waits. The Caldwells themselves were nowhere to be found, though a stable boy claimed to have seen 2 veiled women boarding a stage northward, near the Pawtucket Toll Road. No one could confirm it. Still, the constable sealed the property for further inquiry, filing it as a matter suspended pending evidence. What he did not record, though many whispered, was that the mirror in the parlor, once bright, had turned the color of ash, as though it too had seen something it could not reflect. In early October of 1830, Providence was cloaked in mist that rose nightly from the rivers. The Caldwell house, now boarded, stood like a mausoleum among the clapboard homes. Though the constable had sealed it, curious eyes still peered through cracks between the planks. It was during one such evening that Mrs. Temperance Rowe, who lived across the street, claimed to see a flicker of lamplight from the upper window. Steady as a heart that refused to stop, she later wrote in a note to the sheriff's office. The town authorities grew restless under public pressure. Constable Peterson, urged by Alderman Hiram Blake, reopened the inquiry. This time he was accompanied by Dr. Birch, Reverend Dorr, and a newly assigned scribe, Mr. Nathaniel Pike, to record their observations. The 4 men entered at dawn, careful to disturb as little as possible. Inside, dust lay thick but undisturbed since their first search. Dr. Birch remarked that the scent of lavender had faded, replaced by something faintly metallic. On the mantel sat a new addition, a folded letter sealed with black wax. The initials EC were stamped crudely in the wax's center. The letter's contents, recorded in Pike's notes, were brief and unsettling. She will not sleep, though I have tried the draft again. The mirror clouds at every hour. If I falter, she will rise before dawn, and the bells will toll for both. Birch and Peterson exchanged uneasy glances. No one could determine which sister had written the note, but it suggested that one of them, at least, had remained in the house after others believed it abandoned. The letter was sent to the town records office, but its ink had already begun to fade by the time it arrived. Within months its words were nearly illegible. Only the phrase "she will rise" remained distinct. This peculiar fading was later mentioned in a 19th-century article comparing local mysteries during the 1832 cholera years, citing the Caldwell case as an example of fear's contagion, much like disease itself. That winter was harsh. Freezing rain slicked the rooftops, and hunger spread with the cold. The cholera threat still lingered in the southern papers, and Providence kept watch at its ports. Amid that climate of illness and isolation, any mention of the Caldwell sisters began to draw suspicion. Some whispered they had been taken by the fever before it was named, while others insisted they had fled north, their minds undone by mourning and grief. Yet 2 reports filed separately challenged both assumptions. One came from Dr. Birch, who claimed he glimpsed Eveline Caldwell standing beside a well near North Burial Ground in late December, her dress thin against the frost. The second came from a carter named Samuel Brigham, who swore he saw the younger sister, Clara, near the Old Mill Road that same week, wearing the same bonnet she'd been known for, though her eyes looked clouded, as though time itself had filmed them over. Neither account was verified, but both appeared in the Providence Daily Journal under the quiet headline, "The Caldwell Apparitions, Fact or Fear." By January of 1831, Providence found itself divided, between those who feared the unseen and those who demanded reason. The story of the Caldwell sisters had spread far beyond Benefit Street. Shopkeepers whispered their names, sailors invoked them before voyages, and even the children who sold papers avoided passing their house after dusk. The Providence Daily Journal continued to print small updates, treating the mystery as a human interest curiosity. But among the poorer wards, the case became something else entirely, an omen. Constable Peterson, burdened by ridicule for his failure to bring the girls to ground, reopened the sealed property a third time. He requested assistance from Dr. Ezra Moffat, a physician recently returned from Boston, known for his studies during the 1832 cholera epidemic. Moffat had written extensively on how prolonged isolation could mimic the symptoms of fever, delusion, fainting, pallor. He believed the Caldwell case could be one of mistaken contagion. "There is no ghost," Moffat noted dryly in his ledger, "only the shadow that grief leaves when it cannot find an end." Together with Peterson and a clerk, he surveyed the Caldwell residence once again. The parlor remained as before, but in the cellar they found a fresh disturbance, soil that had been recently turned, though the house had been locked from the outside. Beneath the floorboards, wrapped in muslin, was a child's doll with glass eyes missing. Inside the doll's torso lay a folded note. "Still she wakes at dawn." Moffat, a rational man, dismissed it as a prank left by intruders or children. Yet the clerk swore that the handwriting matched the earlier letter's fading script. The constable ordered the doll sealed in a municipal evidence box and sent to the courthouse archives. No one could later find that box. Its record was marked misfiled. By spring, Providence was under tension. The first real warnings of cholera reached the docks that March, confirming what the papers from New York had feared. The Rhode Island Chronicle printed public notices for citizens to boil water, burn refuse, and avoid gatherings. The Caldwell home was once again roped off, this time not as a haunted dwelling, but as a potential health hazard. And yet, people still claimed to see lights there. A cooper named Josiah Brand reported that, while delivering barrels to a tavern one rainy evening, he saw a glow from the upper window, a candle burning, though the storm made the air thick as milk. He shouted for any living soul to answer. The light went out instantly. Soon the townsfolk began to mark the nights when that glow appeared. It came every fortnight near the half moon. Always the same window. Always a single light. Dr. Moffat tried to reason it out. He said it was the trick of damp air on old glass. Nothing more. But his assistant, Nathaniel Pike, wrote in his journal a very different thought. If the cholera has not reached Providence yet, then something else has, a sickness not of the body but of time. By May of 1831, the Caldwell house had become both a warning and a fascination. Travelers from neighboring towns would pause at Benefit Street merely to see the shuttered home that no one dared enter. Children placed pebbles on the doorstep for luck, believing that if the stones were gone by morning, the sisters had walked again. The authorities, however, were less amused. Following a formal petition by Reverend Dorr and a handful of merchants who lived nearby, the mayor ordered the constable to clear the property and examine it once more. This time a clerk from the city archives, Mr. Abel Curtis, was assigned to catalogue every item for evidence or auction. Curtis was young, meticulous, and eager to impress. Over 2 days he inventoried furniture, documents, and personal effects. In his surviving notebook, now held in the Providence Athenaeum collection, he described finding a small bundle of correspondence, bound in red thread and hidden inside the frame of an upstairs mirror. The letters were brittle and water-stained, but several bore clear signatures, E. Caldwell and C. Caldwell. One letter, dated June 1829, was addressed to a Mr. Henry Talcott of Pawtucket, believed to have been a physician's assistant. In it, Eveline wrote, "The draft has worked only in part. Clara speaks less, but her dreams still disturb her rest. I fear what will become of her if she continues to wake with the dawn's first toll. The bell no longer sounds for me." Another, unsigned, contained a line that later drew the attention of the Providence Medical Review. He said the pulse stops, then resumes, slower each time. We are to wait for the silence to last an hour. To Dr. Moffat, these fragments hinted at early medical experimentation, perhaps involving tinctures of belladonna or laudanum, both known to induce paralysis, mistaken for death. He compared the findings to accounts from European cases of suspended animation noted in journals during the 1832 cholera years, when patients were feared dead but revived after burial. Though speculative, Moffat believed the sisters might have pursued such treatments in secret. The city council dismissed his report as conjecture. Yet local gossip seized upon the idea. The Caldwells were now called the women who defied the clock. Some said they had tested potions to escape mortality. Others whispered they had simply fallen victim to the same unholy fever that stalked the docks. Then in early June, Mr. Curtis disappeared. He had returned to the Caldwell house alone to verify a note in his ledger. When he failed to appear at the courthouse by morning, a search party was formed. They found his satchel near the gate, his ledger open, pages soaked from rain, but no sign of the man himself, only the faint imprint of shoes leading to the cellar door and stopping there. The lock was still intact. Constable Peterson wrote in his final report on the matter, "The young man may have fled, though to what end I cannot reckon. The house remains still and patient. If evil dwells there, it waits politely." By late summer of 1831, the air over Providence hung heavy with humidity and rumor. The missing clerk, Abel Curtis, had never been found. His family placed notices in the Providence Patriot, offering a $30 reward for any information, but none came. In taverns and markets, whispers returned to the Caldwell sisters that they had taken another, that the house needed to be fed. The stories grew more elaborate as the heat lingered. At North Burial Ground, groundskeeper Jeremiah Flagg claimed he often saw two figures walking among the graves near dawn, dressed in mourning and holding lamps that did not flicker. He described one as taller, the other frailer, both moving slowly as if pacing the same path again and again. When he called out, the women turned, and in the grey light he saw that their faces were pale as wax, their eyes reflecting no glint of the lantern flame. He fled, later telling the sexton he had looked upon time misplaced. At first, Reverend Dorr dismissed such claims as hysteria. But when several congregants repeated similar accounts, he reopened his old notes from the year before. Among them, he found his initial affidavit describing the sisters' unrested mother and their refusal of visitors. He sent a copy to Dr. Ezra Moffat, whose interest in the case had not waned. Moffat replied in measured tones, citing the continued threat of the 1832 cholera contagion as reason for public caution. But he also added a cryptic line, "Illness is not always of the flesh, Reverend. Sometimes it is of the hour." That autumn, strange incidents multiplied. A cooper's apprentice swore he saw a woman kneeling by the riverbank at midnight, her dress soaked to the hem, yet leaving no footprints on the mud. Two dockhands claimed a veiled lady asked them for directions back to Benefit Street, though when they turned to point, she had vanished. Dr. Moffat, concerned by the panic, proposed a final examination of the Caldwell property, not for haunting but for health hazard. He was granted permission by the mayor's office to enter under municipal supervision. On September 19, 1831, he and Constable Peterson returned once more to the house, accompanied by a young apprentice from the infirmary named James Ellery. The structure was showing its age, plaster sagged, the windows filmed over with grime. In the parlor, where once stood that mirror turned to ash, they found something new, a set of muddy footprints leading from the hearth to the back hallway. They appeared fresh. Ellery noted in his field log that the prints were too small for a man, likely from a lady's slipper. They followed them toward the staircase but lost them halfway up, as though the person had simply ceased to exist between one step and the next. When they searched the upper floor, they found nothing disturbed, except the sampler on the wall, which now bore one additional stitched word beneath the faded name, Evil. The word was still. Reverend Dorr, when informed, grew pale. Still, he said softly, was the word she used when speaking of her mother's soul. By October of 1831, Providence could no longer ignore the growing fear that had settled over Benefit Street. Merchants refused to pass the Caldwell home after sunset, and even the lamplighters began skipping that stretch entirely. The mayor's office, facing increasing complaints, ordered a night watch to be stationed nearby. Two men were selected, Deputy Alan Briggs and Watchman Thomas Leary, both veterans of the Port Authority and not prone to superstition. Their assignment was simple: observe the property from dusk until dawn, record any lights, noises, or trespassers, and report by morning. The first 2 nights were uneventful. The house stood quiet under a silver moon, the shutters unmoved, the air still. On the 3rd night, however, Briggs wrote in his log that he heard soft pacing within the walls around 2 o'clock. When he approached the front stoop, The noise ceased. Moments later, Leary pointed toward the second-floor window. A faint glow, the same single light that had been reported for over a year. Briggs knocked on the door and called out for any inhabitant. No answer. The glow persisted for nearly a minute, then dimmed slowly, as though the lamp were turned by unseen hands. Leary later swore, under oath, that just before the light vanished, he saw two figures standing behind the curtain, not reflections, not tricks of fog, but two women, one slightly taller, their faces pale as candle smoke. The following morning, Dr. Moffat and Constable Peterson reviewed their accounts. Moffat, still clinging to reason, suggested that phosphorescence from decaying plaster or damp air on mercury mirrors could create illusions of light. But privately, he noted in his ledger, both men described the same height, the same presence. Illusion does not repeat itself with such precision. As autumn deepened, Providence began to resemble a city half paralyzed by invisible illness. Though the cholera epidemic of 1832 had not yet reached its peak, fear itself was contagious. People kept to their homes, shutters closed, prayers whispered. The Caldwell sisters had become a cautionary tale for isolation and grief, though no one could agree whether they were dead, missing, or something in between. In November, a committee of citizens petitioned to have the house demolished, calling it an offense to the living and a harbor for spirits or sickness. The motion was denied for lack of legal authority. The property technically still belonged to the sisters, who were never declared deceased. Then, one icy night, Watchman Leary failed to appear for his shift. Briggs waited until midnight before checking the nearby alleys. There he found Leary's coat folded neatly against the fence beside the Caldwell gate, his lantern extinguished, the wick still warm. Of the man himself, no trace was ever discovered. 3 days later, Briggs resigned from the watch. His final entry in the log read only, "The light burns when no living hand should tend it." Constable Peterson sealed the notebook in the municipal archive. Though in later years, researchers noted that the final page had yellowed differently from the rest, darker, as if touched by heat or ash. By December of 1831, the Providence Constabulary could no longer treat the Caldwell affair as rumor. The disappearance of Watchman Leary forced an official inquest, presided over by Magistrate Horace Leland, a man known for his meticulous adherence to procedure. Dr. Ezra Moffat was called as a witness, along with Constable Peterson and surviving night watchman Briggs. The hearing took place in the cold upper chamber of the City Hall. Its windows rimed with frost. Leland ordered the property reopened and examined once more, this time under municipal supervision, with all findings to be sealed in record. What began as a formal investigation would soon become Providence's most quietly haunting inquiry. The party entered the house on the morning of December 14, 1831. The winter sun offered little warmth as their boots echoed across the warped floorboards. Beneath the parlor hearth, where soot lay thick and undisturbed, they found a faint seam in the brickwork. With some effort, the men pried loose a section and uncovered a shallow cavity lined with mortar dust. Inside lay a single folded document and a small metal pendant shaped like an hourglass. The document, brittle, smudged and partly illegible, appeared to be a medical note, possibly written by Eveline Caldwell. Its first line, as transcribed by Clerk Nathaniel Pike, read, "The pulse resumes, slower, each time nearer to stillness." Below it were a series of numbers and measurements, the meaning unclear. Moffat studied the note carefully, and later compared it to European experiments reported during the 1832 cholera investigations, when physicians observed patients who seemed dead, but revived hours later. He mentioned these parallels in his testimony, though he cautioned that such reports were largely dismissed as hysteria or exaggeration. The pendant was more troubling. When examined in daylight, it showed faint engravings of two initials, EC and CC, joined by a fine line that looped back upon itself, forming a symbol not unlike an infinity mark. On the reverse, the inscription read, "Until the hour forgets the name." Leland ordered both items sealed and placed under the clerk's care. Within a month, both the document and the pendant vanished from the courthouse archives. The clerk responsible for their safekeeping left town shortly after, reportedly to visit kin in Worcester. He never returned. Public reaction was swift. Though the newspapers printed only a small notice, the rumor spread that the sisters had discovered some unnatural means of halting the passage of life itself. "Time forgot them," one broadsheet declared, a phrase that would cling to the story for decades. Through the long winter, the house remained untouched. A light snow covered the shutters. The roof sagged slightly under ice, and the front step cracked under the cold. Reverend Dorr remarked in his journal, "The place endures as the dead endure, unchanged, unburied, waiting for acknowledgement." When spring thawed the streets the following year, Providence prepared for new fears. Ships arriving from Boston carried warnings of sickness. The cholera, which had ravaged the world abroad, was now rumored to have reached Rhode Island's shore. By the summer of 1832, Providence trembled beneath two overlapping fears: the spreading cholera epidemic and the lingering shadow of the Caldwell house. News of the disease came first from New York, then Boston, until by July the Providence Journal confirmed that 3 suspected cases had appeared along the waterfront. Citizens burned tar barrels in the streets, hung sprigs of mint at their doors, and avoided one another as though conversation itself might spread contagion. Against this grim backdrop, whispers began again about the Caldwells. A rumor circulated that the sisters' home had been the first site of infection, that the illness had slept in the walls, waiting to awaken. It began when 2 dock workers who lived nearby fell ill and died within days. The local rumor sheets immediately christened their deaths "the sickness of time," borrowing the phrase from the broadsheet printed months before. Reverend Dorr, weary from funerals and exhaustion, appealed to reason in his Sunday sermon. "Providence is not cursed by ghosts but by forgetfulness. When we cease to tend to our sick, we turn them into legends. Still, few dared pass the house. Mothers crossed to the opposite side of Benefit Street, and even the lamplighters resumed skipping that stretch entirely." The shuttered home became a symbol of contagion and sin, its silence mistaken for defiance. Dr. Ezra Moffat, now leading a small medical relief committee, again referenced the Caldwell case in his private notes. He compared the public hysteria to earlier European reactions recorded during the 1832 cholera pandemic, where towns had blamed singular families or haunted dwellings for outbreaks they could not explain. He wrote, "It is curious how fear, when starved of reason, will feed upon whatever stands most still." Moffat attempted to inspect the Caldwell property once more for sanitation purposes, but the constable refused, citing public hostility. Instead, the mayor ordered the house boarded up until the threat of contagion had passed. Boards were nailed across the doors, windows sealed with pitch. It might have ended there, but Providence was a city that did not easily forget its ghosts. In August, as the epidemic peaked, a quarantine camp was established outside the city limits. Among the dead recorded that month was a young nurse, Margaret Ainsley, who had reportedly tended to the poor near Benefit Street. Her companion later claimed she dreamed nightly of 2 pale women calling from behind boards. The physician on duty dismissed it as delirium, yet her final words, as recorded in the infirmary's journal, were, "They are not dead, only rehearsing the stillness." When the worst of the outbreak faded that autumn, the city began burning refuse and disinfecting homes. Most believed the Caldwell residence would be demolished. Yet when the workmen arrived, their foreman refused. The foundation, he said, was too unstable. "The ground beneath it doesn't sound right when struck." Thus the house remained, a relic of sickness and silence, untouched as the rest of Providence began to heal. And yet, as Dr. Moffat noted in his closing report that year, of all the addresses in Providence quarantined for cholera, only one remained sealed after the disease was gone: the house of the Caldwell sisters, who were never proven alive nor laid properly among the dead. By 1833, the worst of the cholera had passed, but its echo remained like a stain upon Providence. Survivors walked the streets pale and thinner, speaking in hushed tones about the dead who had been buried too soon, and the few who had awakened hours later. Among these accounts, the Caldwell mystery resurfaced, not in whispers this time, but in the hands of a scholar. At Brown University, Professor Luther Fenwick, an amateur historian of maritime medicine, came across a series of letters archived from Silas Meacham, the same merchant who had once owned the Caldwell property. Meacham's correspondence, dated 1828-1829, referenced a set of preservation experiments conducted aboard a vessel returning from the West Indies. He mentioned an herbal solution capable of halting decay, and noted that samples were left in Providence with the tailor's daughters. Fenwick, intrigued and cautious, forwarded copies of the letters to Dr. Ezra Moffat, who was still compiling his final report on post-cholera public health. Moffat recognized the implication immediately, that the Caldwells may have been involved, willingly or not, in early forms of what the age called vital suspension. To support his suspicion, Moffat referenced notes from the 1832 cholera pandemic archives, where physicians in Paris and Calcutta described patients appearing lifeless for hours before reviving with minimal pulse. Though most cases were attributed to misdiagnosis, the phenomenon fascinated medical circles. If such states could be induced deliberately, through chemical drafts, perhaps it might explain the sisters' obsession with timing, pulse, and stillness. When the physician attempted to retrieve Meacham's surviving crates from the port warehouse, he found they had been marked for destruction years before. One dock clerk remembered them only vaguely. Glass flasks, cloudy fluid, smelled of metal and bitter almonds. The clerk's handwriting matched that of Abel Curtis, the same young archivist who vanished in 1831. That discovery disturbed Moffat deeply. He wrote in his diary, "Either the line of chance bends unnaturally around this family, or Providence itself conspires to preserve their mystery." Reverend Dorr, though older and weary, agreed to visit the Caldwell house once more with Moffat. They found the structure leaning with age, its windows dark, its interior filled with dust thick as sleep. In the parlor, they noticed new marks on the mirror's surface, faint streaks like the print of fingers drawn through condensation. Dorr approached it cautiously, murmuring a prayer. For a fleeting moment, he claimed he saw his own reflection standing beside two women, one on either side, though the room was otherwise empty. The Reverend never returned to the house after that visit. His final sermon, delivered weeks later, closed with the line, "Some souls resist the hour appointed them, but time, like mercy, cannot be bribed." By spring, Dorr was dead, heart failure according to Moffat's record. His funeral drew half the city, yet few noticed that the same week, the Caldwell property quietly changed hands again. The new deed bore no personal name, only a symbol, the looping hourglass, the same found on the pendant beneath the hearth. By the summer of 1834, Providence was restless again. The city had recovered its commerce and population, but its quieter corners still carried traces of what the cholera years had left behind: boarded windows, shuttered houses, and a new superstition that spoke of illnesses that remember. Among these remnants stood the old Caldwell residence, recently purchased by an investor from Massachusetts, whose name was entered in the deed book only as A. Thorne. No one in the clerk's office could later identify this man. The deed fee was paid in full with silver dollars dated 1829, each tarnished black with age. The signature itself, according to the clerk, looked written by a hand unfamiliar with ink, too careful, too even. Within a month, renovation crews arrived to clear the house. Their foreman, Jonas Hale, a stout man known for little patience with gossip, supervised the work personally. He ordered all debris removed and the floors relaid. On the third day, as laborers pried up the rotted timbers near the cellar door, they found something unexpected. Not bones, as some feared, but a narrow wooden chest, sealed with pitch and stamped with the faint impression of that looping hourglass symbol. Hale, thinking it valuables, opened it on sight. Inside lay a series of notebooks bound in leather, still intact despite the damp. The pages, though curled at the edges, were filled with elegant handwriting, identical on every line as if copied by the same hand again and again. The entries described measurements, temperatures, and timing, pulse diminishing, intervals between breath, solution preserved at 41 degrees. In the margins of one book, the name Eveline Caldwell appeared, followed by a chilling entry. "Clara has entered the still hour. Her pulse slowed to 1 every minute. I must join her before dawn lest she wake alone. Dr. Ezra Moffat, upon being summoned to examine the journals, immediately noted their similarity to experimental records from physicians abroad, again recalling those strange accounts of suspended life during the 1832 cholera pandemic. He concluded that the sisters had been conducting rudimentary experiments on the boundary between sleep and death, likely using tinctures of belladonna and opium, but something else disturbed him, the ink itself. It appeared fresh, almost oily, as if written days ago, not years. Moffat tested it with blotting paper and found it still transferable. The journals were sealed in glass cases and sent to the Providence archives for preservation. Within a week, the writing faded entirely, leaving only faint indentations where the pen had pressed. Workers continued their renovations uneasily. Several reported hearing breathing sounds from the cellar when no one was below. One man, Eli Comstock, swore that he saw a woman's reflection in a window pane, though no figure stood behind him. He left the job the next morning and would later tell his wife that the air inside that house beat like a sleeping heart. When renovations ended, A. Thorne never appeared to inspect the work. Payment arrived by courier, and the property remained unoccupied. The house stood locked, silent, and, by all accounts, waiting. Constable Peterson, now retired, passed by one final time and noted in his journal, "The boards are new. The paint still wet, but the feeling as old as ever. Some houses never forget their tenants." By autumn of 1834, the Caldwell house stood seemingly reborn, new floorboards, repaired shutters, and fresh paint dulled by an oddly quick patina of soot. Yet the crew that had restored it was not whole. Within 2 months of the renovation's completion, 3 men from Jonas Hale's team went missing without trace. Their families, uncertain whether to appeal to the constable or to the church, described the same final behaviors: sleeplessness, a fixation with the hourglass mark, and murmured phrases about the still hour. Hale himself began suffering fainting spells and bouts of confusion. He was found wandering the Providence docks one night, muttering that the cellar breathed after dark. When questioned by the watchman, he said he'd gone back to check that the boards hadn't shifted. He was taken to the infirmary and placed under the care of Dr. Ezra Moffat, whose compassion for the afflicted was by then well known after his cholera relief work. Moffat recorded the case in his medical journal. The patient reports auditory illusions, respiration and ticking beneath floors. Hands tremble, eyes unfocused. Temperature low, pulse irregular. He repeats the same line: "They do not rest, they measure." When Hale's condition worsened, Moffat administered laudanum for calm. The following morning, the patient was gone. Only the bedsheet remained, folded with uncanny precision. The constabulary, though weary of the Caldwell legend, opened another investigation. This time led by Inspector Bartholomew Green, a pragmatic man recently transferred from Bristol County. Green insisted on logic and order. "There are no ghosts," he declared to the mayor. "Only liars or fools." He gathered 6 men armed with lanterns and tools and entered the house on October 18, 1834. What they found was carefully documented. Dust lay thick but unbroken. The cellar, newly floored, emitted a low resonance when struck with the butt of a spade. They pried up one plank, and beneath it discovered an empty space lined with slate. The chamber extended several feet into the earth, walls smooth, ceiling reinforced with metal rods. Within the space were 2 stone slabs side by side, each carved with initials barely discernible through age. E.C. and C.C. Green ordered the chamber sealed immediately. "Whatever is buried here," he said, "belongs to the undertaker, not the constable." Yet one of his men, Samuel Dent, insisted on making a sketch before they left. The drawing later entered the city archive, a crude image but unmistakably accurate. Beneath the initials was the faint outline of an hourglass, its sand drawn halfway down. The following week, Inspector Green resigned without explanation and returned to Bristol. Dent left the city altogether. The report, though filed, was never published. Only Dr. Moffat retained a copy of the sketch, noting in his diary, "If the Caldwells sought to master time, perhaps they found a way to mark its boundaries beneath their own home. After that, the house was sealed again, the cellar bricked, the key held by the mayor's office. None could say for certain what, if anything, still lingered behind those walls. Yet, when the wind swept through Benefit Street on cold nights, the locals said they could hear 2 faint knocks from beneath the ground, slow, measured, and always in unison." By the 1840s, Providence had grown into a bustling port once more. The soot of its mills rising above new brick chimneys, the scars of the cholera years softened by commerce and time. Yet among its older citizens, the name Caldwell still carried the weight of unease. Young people whispered the tale in taverns, and preachers invoked it in sermons against those who meddle with God's clock. In 1842, the old house was purchased again, this time by a bookseller named Mr. Elias Turner, who saw it not as a haunted ruin, but as an investment. He planned to convert it into lodgings for sailors. Turner, educated and practical, dismissed the old stories as fancies of an unscientific age. He hired laborers to clear the cellar and open the bricked chamber for renovation. When the bricks were removed, however, the air that escaped was cold, unnaturally so, the workers said, as though the room had been sealed against the seasons. Turner himself descended with a lantern. The stone slabs remained, their carvings faint but unaltered. EC and CC, the marks of the hourglass symbol were still visible, though blurred by damp. Turner ordered the space cleaned and refitted for storage. The next morning, the laborers refused to return. They claimed that while removing debris, one man, Caleb Ford, had uncovered a scrap of muslin cloth wrapped around what appeared to be a glass vial. The vial was empty, yet it reeked faintly of almonds and rust. Within an hour of handling it, Ford collapsed, convulsing. He survived, but his eyesight dimmed permanently. Dr. Jared Whitcomb, a chemist who examined the vial, suspected traces of cyanide, a not uncommon preservative in early anatomical studies. This drew the attention of Professor Luther Fenwick, now an elder scholar at Brown University. Fenwick had written a short paper a decade earlier, linking the Caldwell notes to experiments recorded during the 1832 cholera pandemic, studies in the suspension of vital function. He visited Turner and examined the site himself, taking careful measurements. In a letter to the Providence Gazette, Fenwick wrote, "What superstition calls sorcery may, in truth, be the crude anatomy of science yet unborn. If the Caldwells indeed touched the frontier between breath and silence, they did so not as witches, but as premature physicians." His words sparked controversy. The Gazette published responses both for and against. Clergymen condemned Fenwick for blasphemy, while apothecaries and physicians quietly applauded his curiosity. Some even began calling the sisters the forgotten pioneers, a term that lingered in Providence lecture halls long after. Turner, however, saw no profit in fame. Within months, he sold the property and left for Maine, telling a friend that the place was too still, too aware of being watched. The house passed briefly through several owners before falling vacant again. By 1847, children had taken to daring one another to touch its gate at midnight. Those who did often claimed their watches stopped for several seconds. Whether trick of fear or fault of clock, no one could say, but it was enough to give the old home a new name, the House of the Still Hour. By the 1850s, the Caldwell mystery had evolved from a local warning into something larger, a fragment of New England folklore. The industrial boom brought newcomers to Providence, but even they soon heard the same quiet refrain. Don't linger on Benefit Street after dusk. The hour remembers. Newspapers occasionally revisited the story, mixing fact with invention. A serialized column in the Providence Evening Bulletin, dated 1851, called it "The Tale of the Sisters Who Slept Between Heartbeats." Among the city's educated class, curiosity replaced fear. Amateur societies devoted to psychical phenomena were forming across the region. Gatherings of ministers, doctors, and skeptics who sought to reconcile faith and reason through controlled study. One such group, the Rhode Island Society for Temporal Studies, held meetings at a lecture hall near College Hill. Its founder, Dr. Ambrose Keene, often cited the Caldwell affair as a precedent for time dilation in states of suspended animation. Keene referenced early records from the 1832 cholera pandemic, noting how patients were occasionally declared dead, only to revive hours later, a medical mystery that blurred life's threshold. He argued that the Caldwells might have stumbled upon the same boundary intentionally. In his published paper, On the Stillness Between Seconds, he wrote, "The body is an instrument that may be silenced without being destroyed." The Sisters of Benefit Street may have simply found the note too difficult to end. Though dismissed by Providence's more conservative physicians, Keene's theories drew wide interest. The house became a site of pilgrimage for curiosity seekers. Visitors claimed to feel chills when stepping onto the porch or hear faint rhythmic tapping through the shutters. Others swore that pocket watches stopped momentarily near the gate, then resumed with a faint metallic click. The Providence Journal mocked these accounts in editorials, but quietly, reporters kept returning to the site. One, Sarah Dempsey, a rare female journalist for her time, wrote an unusually sober piece in 1854, describing her own visit. The air about the house is heavy, but not foul, the way a room feels after a long vigil beside the sick. Nothing stirred, yet I could not escape the notion that something beneath the floor was listening. That same year, an aging Dr. Ezra Moffat, now near 70, was interviewed by a Boston physician compiling a book on unexplained recoveries. Moffat declined to speculate, but admitted that the sisters' bodies were never found. They may have perished, he said, or they may simply have escaped the hour appointed to them. Soon after that interview, Moffat died quietly in his study. His journals, dozens of volumes covering decades of Providence's plagues, including entries on the cholera epidemic of 1832, the Caldwell letters, and the missing inspector, were sealed by his executor and placed in the archives of Brown University, where they remain to this day, accessible only by special request. As the century turned toward the age of steam and telegraph, the legend of the Caldwell sisters became less a story of fear and more one of fascination. Yet for those who lived nearest the house, fascination was simply another name for dread. By 1857, Providence had entered the age of invention. Steam carriages rattled down the cobbled streets, and photography, still a new and wondrous art, promised to capture what the eye alone could not. With curiosity rekindled, a group of young photographers from Benefit Street resolved to test whether the Caldwell home could yield proof of its restlessness. The project was led by Mr. Alaric Webb, a daguerreotypist known for his portraits of the city's merchant families. Webb believed that long exposures could reveal traces of motion unseen. By the waking eye, he and two assistants set up their equipment across from the Caldwell house on the foggy night of October 29th, 1857. The first plate developed perfectly, the silent facade, shutters closed, lamplight dim. But the second plate, taken minutes later under identical conditions, showed something faint behind an upper window. Two silhouettes, almost symmetrical, standing side by side. The exposure had captured no faces, only outlines, as though the figures had been drawn in smoke. Webb dismissed it at first as a flaw in the silvering or chemical haze. Yet when he attempted a third exposure, his camera lens fogged from within, though the night air was dry. One assistant swore he saw a hand press briefly against the glass. Startled, Webb dropped a plate, slicing his palm open. The wound, he later noted, bled longer than such a cut should. The daguerreotypes, 3 in total, were displayed weeks later at a local salon. Visitors agreed the second plate was the strangest. Though the image was faint, the curtains in the window appeared drawn back slightly, though none remembered them ever open. The photograph caused such stir that the Providence Journal printed an engraving of it. Under the headline, "Echoes on Silver, the House of the Still Hour." In the ensuing debate, several scholars referenced the 1832 cholera pandemic, arguing that lingering mercury vapors from early medical experiments could have caused hallucinatory effects. A chemist, Dr. Samuel Dow, speculated that the Caldwell's tinctures and preserved specimens might have left residue absorbed by the house's walls, a theory connecting science to superstition with unsettling ease. That winter, Webb attempted to reproduce his results, returning alone. He never succeeded. None of his later photographs showed any figures, and the plates developed normally. He retired within the year, citing ill health and persistent trembling. His final journal entry read simply, "They stood still for so long, I forgot which frame was mine." By the late 1850s, the Caldwell story had entered every anthology of Rhode Island folklore. Ministers still condemned it, skeptics studied it, and the curious continued to visit the address. Yet the house endured unchanged, its boards graying, its door warped, its air unnaturally still. Neighbors began saying that every 27 years, the place seemed to breathe again, that new witnesses always arose, repeating the same words as those before them. I saw 2 women at the window waiting for the hour to end, and in Providence people learned to simply nod and say, "Then it must be their season again." By the time the Civil War reached its darkest years, Providence had changed once again. The city's industries thrived on war contracts. Ironworks, textiles, medical supplies, and the once-forgotten house on Benefit Street found itself swept into the machinery of necessity. In 1863, it was requisitioned by the Rhode Island Relief Committee as temporary storage for hospital equipment and donated linens. Few volunteers wished to enter, and those who did refused to stay after nightfall. The foreman assigned to the site, Captain Jerome Dyer, was a veteran of Antietam, a man not given to imagination. His records, preserved in the state archives, describe a structure unsound but serviceable, though the air remains curiously still, even when windows stand open. He stationed a pair of convalescent soldiers, Private Amos Vale and Sergeant Luke Ferrin, to guard the place overnight. Their watch lasted barely a week. On June 11, 1863, Dyer's log notes, guards absent at roll call, found their post undisturbed save for one lamp still burning. No signs of struggle. Door secured from inside. The following day, the lamp was examined by quartermaster staff. It contained oil, but the wick was unburned, as if the flame had shone without consuming anything. Dyer, unnerved, ordered the building vacated. Soon after, workers unloading crates at the docks began reporting strange accidents. Spilled barrels, ropes snapping, and a persistent ticking sound that echoed from empty carts. When asked, one man muttered that it was just the sisters counting again. The legend revived overnight. The Providence Evening Bulletin ran a short piece titled "The House That Marks the Hour," quoting elderly residents who still remembered the cholera years. "It is Providence's punishment," one woman said, "for locking the living away with the dead." During that same summer, Dr. Silas Pember, a physician tending to soldiers at the state hospital, revisited the Caldwell case while researching rare coma-like fevers. He cited Dr. Ezra Moffat's old writings, still referenced in medical circles for their documentation of the 1832 cholera pandemic, and drew striking parallels. "The Caldwells," he wrote, "may represent an early misunderstanding of catalepsy or self-induced torpor. Yet if their work was indeed chemical, their success or failure remains unproven. The human frame cannot long outwit the pulse." Pember's article reignited public debate, and the Relief Committee quickly abandoned use of the property to avoid scandal. The building fell silent once again. But residents near Benefit Street reported that, for several nights after the soldiers vanished, the house seemed to pulse faintly with a dull, amber glow, as though someone inside were tending lamps from another century. Captain Dyer left Providence soon after and never returned. Decades later, his granddaughter donated his field journal to a local museum. On the final page, written in a hand unsteady but deliberate, were the words, "I do not think they mean harm. I think they only wish the clock to stop turning without them." By 1865, the war was over, and the house was once again shuttered, unchanged, unclaimed and as ever waiting. After the war ended, Providence tried to move forward, but the House of the Still Hour refused to be forgotten. By 1869, the city was home to a new fascination: seances, table rapping, and the promise of messages from the departed. The war had filled too many graves, and grief had become a language everyone spoke. The old Caldwell residence, long sealed and silent, drew the attention of a small circle of spiritualists who saw in it a doorway unclosed. Among them was Mrs. Eliza Morell, a well-known medium who had once toured New England under the name Madame Ellery. She claimed to communicate with those who linger between heartbeats. In the winter of 1870, she petitioned the mayor's office for permission to hold a single supervised séance inside the Caldwell house to lay the unrest of its history. To everyone's surprise, permission was granted. The gathering took place on February 14, 1870, under supervision of Inspector Nathaniel Pike, Jr., the son of the clerk who had once transcribed Eveline Caldwell's letter decades earlier. His report survives in the municipal archives, written in a terse professional hand. The party entered the house at 9 o'clock. Conditions cold, air dry, moon half full. 4 candles placed upon table in former parlor. Participants: Mrs. Morell, her assistant, 2 witnesses, and myself. According to Pike's account, the séance began with formal invocation. For 20 minutes, nothing occurred beyond the creak of settling boards. Then one candle flickered, though no draught was present. Mrs. Morell asked aloud, "Who waits within this hour?" The second candle went out. Witnesses swore that a faint rhythmic tapping began beneath the floor, slow, deliberate, in pairs. Pike wrote, "It resembled no animal or structural sound. The rhythm was precise, 2 knocks, pause, 2 again, akin to the pattern of a heartbeat. When Mrs. Morell placed her hand on the table, she reportedly whispered that 2 are near, 1 silent, 1 waking." She began reciting names, pausing at Eveline. The table moved slightly, scraping the floor. One of the witnesses fled the room. Pike ended the session immediately, ordering all candles extinguished. Before leaving, Mrs. Morell handed him a small scrap of paper she said had appeared beneath her palm during the séance. It read in faded cursive, "The hour forgets nothing." The following morning, Pike sealed the note in his report. Within a week, Mrs. Morell fell ill and died of pneumonia. When the document was reopened years later, the note had turned blank. Only the faint imprint of the words remained. Newspapers treated the story with morbid delight. The Providence Gazette ran the headline, "Ghosts of the Still Hour Speak Once More." Yet among scholars it reignited discussion about the Caldwell's pursuit of suspended life. Several essays referenced earlier accounts from the 1832 cholera pandemic, proposing that chemical traces or residual toxins could produce mild hallucinatory phenomena. But for those who lived nearby, no such explanation mattered. They began hearing the tapping again, always 2 knocks, always before dawn, and each February thereafter, someone swore to see 2 dim silhouettes framed behind that upper window, motionless as clock hands waiting to move again. By the 1880s, Benefit Street had changed beyond recognition. The city grew around it. Gas lamps replaced oil, streetcars clattered past brick storefronts, and Brown University expanded its solemn halls over the old hills. Yet amid all this progress, the Caldwell house still stood. Leaning slightly, shutters warped, the roof bowed under time. It seemed like an artifact that Providence had simply decided to ignore. No one had lived there for decades. Property taxes lapsed, records grew uncertain, and by 1883 even the city clerks were unsure who legally owned it. A carpenter named Mr. Gideon Prowse, contracted to appraise the structure for demolition, entered the house with 2 assistants, one grey March morning. According to his statement, they found the rooms dry and intact, too intact. Dust was sparse, as though the place had been quietly tended. The air was heavy, faintly perfumed with lavender. In the parlor, the men found a small desk pushed against the wall. Inside one drawer lay a folded note in delicate, almost ornamental handwriting. It read, "We are nearly done measuring. The last hour draws even. Let them close the door behind us." Prowse pocketed the note, later presenting it to the magistrate, though it vanished soon afterward. He did, however, keep one item from the desk, a silver locket engraved with the looping hourglass symbol. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, one of Eveline, one of Clara, aged but faintly smiling. The faces looked serene, yet behind the paint under magnification, fine cracks formed the faint pattern of a clock dial. 3 weeks later, on the night of April 2, 1883, a fire broke out on Benefit Street. It spread quickly, consuming several abandoned structures before the brigade contained it. When the smoke cleared, the Caldwell house was gone, reduced to cinders and blackened stone. Witnesses swore that the flames had moved unnaturally, burning inward rather than outward, as though the fire had begun deep beneath the ground. Among the rubble, firefighters found only 2 things unburned: a shard of glass shaped like part of an hourglass curve, and a single brick, etched faintly with the letters EC and CC. Both were sent to the Historical Society. Though the brick has since disappeared, the site was never rebuilt. City plans simply marked the plot as lot vacant, unstable ground. Even now, old residents of Providence claim that no vegetation grows there, that compasses spin briefly when set upon the soil, and that pocket watches stop for a second or 2 before resuming their tick. When a Brown University historian revisited the affair in 1888, he closed his essay with words that have since become part of local legend. If the Caldwells sought to master time, then perhaps time, merciful or cruel, granted their wish, not life eternal, but a single unending moment. And so they remain, unaged and unburied within Providence itself, where the hour never quite forgets. Even now, when fog drifts up from the river and the gaslights dim, the locals say the street grows quieter than it should, as though somewhere beneath the cobblestones, two sisters are still counting the seconds they were never meant to have.